Hello, welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Seán Pieper, and I'm joined today by Vicky Nicolson, SNP Councillor for the Inverleith Ward in Edinburgh, and by Hugh Marshall, activist for Welsh independence and founder of Talking Wales. Welcome both to the programme.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We begin today with an update on the conflict in Ukraine. World leaders have gathered at a Swiss mountain resort above Lake Lucerne on Saturday to try to build support for Ukraine's peace proposals at a two-day international summit. More than 90 countries are taking part in the event, where Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky predicted the world would see history being made. China is attending, while Russia has not been invited. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz said that G7 leaders did not discuss Vladimir Putin's proposals for peace in Ukraine, since everyone knew that they were not meant seriously. Scholz said that the Russian president's proposals for Ukraine to abandon 4 provinces, to stop fighting, and to drop its ambition of NATO membership were aimed only at distracting from the conference. Excuse me. Sorry, and a correction from earlier, China is not attending the conference, and nor is Russia. A draft of the final summit declaration, reported in the media, blames Russia's war in Ukraine for causing large-scale human suffering and destruction, and urges Ukraine's territorial integrity to be respected. The document, dated 13th of June, also calls for Kyiv to regain control of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and access to its seaports. Excuse me. On Sunday, 3 topics will be discussed in detail in working groups at the summit: nuclear safety, the freedom of navigation and food security, and humanitarian aspects. These will look at Black Sea shipping, prisoners of war, civilian detainees, and deported children. Meanwhile, US Vice President Kamala Harris, who attended the summit in place of President Biden, announced more than $1.5 billion in aid for Ukraine. This $1.5 billion includes $500 million in new funding for energy assistance and the redirecting of $324 million in previously announced funds towards emergency energy infrastructure repair and other needs in Ukraine. She also announced more than $379 million in humanitarian assistance from the State Department and the US Agency for International Development to help refugees and other people affected by the conflict. Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni has stated that the EU will not directly contribute to a $50 billion loan to Ukraine, agreed by the G7 leaders. At a press conference closing the G7 summit in Bari, she gave fresh details about the about the $50 billion loan to Ukraine, to be funded out of the interest accrued from the $230 billion of frozen Russian state assets, saying that the cash will be provided by the US, Canada, UK, and probably Japan. Currently, European nations are not involved, she said. On Saturday, Finnish President Alexander Stubb said the conference needed a follow-up as soon as possible, because peace is always a process, he told the more than 50 leaders gathered at a hotel overlooking Lake Lucerne. We have 1,300 kilometres of border with Russia. Russia invaded Finland in World War II, and we lost 10% of our territory, including the land where my grandparents were born and where my father was born. Meanwhile, 3 people were killed and 5 wounded by Russian shelling. By Russian shelling in Ulkali village in the eastern Ukrainian region of Donetsk, according to local governor Vadim Plashkin, who said that the village was hit by cluster munitions. Ukrainian shelling on the Russian border town of Shelikabino killed 5 people and wounded several, according to the governor of Belgorod region. Swedish fighter jets have intercepted a Russian military aircraft after it briefly violated Sweden's airspace on Friday, east of the Baltic island of Gotland. And Peter Pellegrini, an ally of Ukraine skeptic Prime Minister Robert Fico was sworn in as Slovakia's new president. Now, with this conference taking place in Switzerland, we see the G7, we see members of the EU, much despite Giorgia Meloni's protestations, sort of coming together to try and formulate a policy for peace. It's not a peace summit, it's one side trying to get their ducks in a row. However, in the current politically sort of turbulent moment that we're in, with multiple elections coming up in the wake of the EU elections, I'm just wondering what risks are there, pardon me, what risks are there that actually this sort of cooperation or this coherent front could actually be looking much shakier by the end of the year? I'm thinking particularly in relation to the US presidential election. How would you respond to that, Vicky? How does the current sort of attempt to try and formulate a peace negotiation look? Do you think this will bear results?
I suppose for me, it comes back to what I see coming into my inbox. So, as a counsellor, what I get an awful lot of correspondence from people who feel quite powerless when it comes to what's happening globally and what's happening in Europe at present with Ukraine and lots of other issues. And I think it shows such a lot that people don't know. I do feel extremely powerless at present because they're writing to me as their local counsellor to bring me issues about international relations and ask for my kind of help and support. And um, it, it says a lot about the way that people don't feel represented and they don't feel that they have any way to express themselves. As far as bringing an end to the Ukraine war, I'm not sure I'm the right person to answer that question, and I do hope that we make some progress. Can I hand you back to you maybe on this one?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just reflecting on what you said, actually. The idea that people are coming to you with issues around foreign policy, obviously that must also be quite frustrating in a sense for you, because there is a real limit on what a local councillor can kind of push towards that. But certainly hopelessness in the face of external foreign policy issues seems to be growing. How would you reflect on the current moment, Hugh?
Yeah, I think it was interesting. Sort of the recent discussions. We're looking at a 10-year period of support, and I think there was an intention there, almost as a safety net if Trump does win in November, because I think one thing we need to realise, and this was discussed with an American correspondent on the radio last week, is the support for Ukraine against Russia in the United States is much bigger than the support for Trump. And even with Trump's base, even though there are some people who, are against it, the majority are. So even if Trump does win in November, it's going to be very hard for him to try and change, their tack. And it's going to be interesting because obviously, Trump has said if he was president, then it would come to an end within a day. So we'll see. If he does win, God forbid, we'll see how politically incompetent and inept that he is, because obviously you can't bring something like this to an end in a day unless Ukraine cedes territories to Russia, and they're not likely to do that.
No, indeed. And I think that's a very fair point as well in relation to, candidate Trump the first time around and the first term, or hopefully only term of President Trump. They looked quite different. Once you are the US president, you are sort of constrained to some extent, not just by your electorate, but also by the state itself. So I think that's a very fair point to raise. And also interesting that, even within the Republican Party, Republican politicians have been ever more skeptical of the US's Ukraine policy, but that actually that doesn't necessarily cut through to voters on the ground who tend to be sort of more sort of straightforwardly seeing this as the US defending the liberty of one of its allies. Now, turning to the situation in Gaza, obviously, unfortunately, the programme this week is going to be utterly riddled with general election talk. But what I wanted to sort of reflect on in relation to this is the fact that we have seen this week the Labour Party in their manifesto sort of try to push the idea that they, as countries like Ireland, Norway and Spain have done, that they will push for the UK to recognise a Palestinian state. Not really the same sort of clarity in terms of arms sales, though they are receiving pressure on that. My question to both of you essentially is, can we put any trust in these sort of electoral promises? You know, we've certainly seen up till this point how many U-turns the Labour Party has made, how many promises have been dropped or amended. Are we likely to see similar with this? You know, in the bluntest terms, is this pure electioneering on Labour's part? I'll turn to you first, Hugh.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, well, there's, I think the latest number, correct me if I'm wrong, is an estimated 37,000 Palestinians have died since the 7th of October. And I think another 85,000 have been injured. You know, it is something, you know, that's deeply worried. You know, we know what the Conservatives' stance is because, you know, they're the party in government. There are many within their parties, when you think of people like Badenoch, you know, and others who, you know, there's quite a strong pro-Israeli lobby there. With Labour, you know, the concern is when you see people like, is it Luke Ashurst?
Akehurst,
you know,
yes.
Akehurst, being parachuted into Durham. You know, that are sort of, you know, because I think, you know, he's out as a, you know, pro Zionist, even though he's not Israeli or Jewish himself, which I find a bit odd. Yeah, you know, there's so many people who will be voting Labour, whether, you know, they're doing it with enthusiasm or, you know, holding their nose, who want to see action taken in Palestine in helping resolve the situation. So Labour, you know, when Starmer becomes Prime Minister, and it's very likely that he will become Prime Minister, he is going to be under pressure to listen to those voices who elected him, despite their sort of misgivings on, you know, his initial approach towards, you know, he's obviously moved around now to, you know, to with the political situation as he tends to do. But yeah, you know, one would hope that a new government, you know, it's going to be different, because obviously you can't, you know, what the Conservatives are doing, you know, they're not really doing anything. So fingers crossed, you would hope that there will be change.
Well, that would be the hope, although, as you said, sort of pointing out individuals like Luke Akehurst and the influence that he will likely have within the next government, but also simply the fact that approximately 25% of members of parliament have received money from various sort of Israeli backing groups. You know, that paper trail remains there to be followed, and I'm sure there will be more that comes out in relation to that in the future. I was also reflecting with this moment of sort of discomfort for Labour in terms of foreign policy. I was thinking back, obviously, to the resistance to the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Although obviously that was an issue for a government and what a government was doing. Here we have an incumbent that is being sort of hit over foreign policy issues. Vicky, would you see any potential parallels in this situation as well, or do you think this is something sort of completely new and unprecedented?
Well, yeah, I mean, I remember it well back in 2003, and it was an extremely disappointing period for those of us that had supported Labour into government in 1997. But I, I just wanted to say it is Eid today, and I suppose it's such an important day for Muslim people, and we're all seeing the devastating numbers in Gaza today, as we are every day, and I know that we're all thinking of all those people. I've got a teenage daughter who's not much younger than I was probably back in 2003, and she's watching this play out, and as are her generation. She's nearly 16. She's so angry that Labour haven't done enough and haven't said the right things, and you know, even things like Israel performing in Eurovision when Russia had been banned, and these harrowing images that our young people are seeing every day on every single social media platform. They're not going to forget this. And I'm pleased to hear Hugh's optimism, but again, I get constituents writing to me all the time about Gaza, and it just shows how powerless people feel about what they're seeing unfolding. And we're now hearing Starmer spoke to President Herzog before his amendment to the SNP motion, and it just horrifies me that Labour are going to win this election, and they're the best choice for the country. The war crimes that are coming out, according to the UN Human Rights Commission, using starvation and torture against civilians, so much more needs to be done. And I am glad to hear that Labour are, moving more in the right direction. But that, as you say, you're talking about 25% of people in Parliament are receiving money from pro-Israeli groups, Friends of Israel, etc. It's hard to see how it can go in the right direction.
And indeed, that it can go in the right direction in actual deed more than just in words or in performative actions. I just, to your point about your daughter as well, I think that the rhetoric often around elections certainly is, they're never won on foreign policy issues, all the rest of it. And I believe that to be broadly true. However, I think there's a real risk of the political class in the UK at the moment underestimating how shocked people are by what they see in relation to this, how angry, how distressed at the inaction, and at whatever point and in whatever form, I think it's inevitable that this conflict and the reaction to it from British politicians will have consequences, will have a legacy in British politics as well, in exactly the same way as the Iraq War did. Now, turning to the first of the elections that we're going to speak about today, not the general election, but rather the European election, which we've been observing as spectators rather surreally. But I would ask both of you, first off, how you would react to sort of the general sweep of the results. Obviously, much of the talk has been about the sort of the positive results for the far right across Europe, and then also kind of we'll look a little bit at the upcoming election in France. But Hugh, how would you kind of see the broad sweep of the EU election and the ramifications?
Yeah, I'm just looking at the sort of the makeup of the Parliament now. I think it's worth noting. I think that I know we're going to discuss the situation in France, but I think what Macron realised was that that there's an impression that the far right have got huge support, but the reality is the turnout for EU elections is quite low compared to general elections. So I think what they're obviously the right have been successful in mobilising their sort of positions, but the situation hasn't really changed that hugely. It's still very much a centre right sort of focused parliament. Whether the extreme right have got that level of support when you actually push people to come out to vote, because I think we saw with the Brexit Party, it was I think a lot of people were just not motivated by voting in European elections, and they let sort of Brexit, UKIP, or whatever they are these days, or they were then, in through the back door. I think it's fascinating as well in this context is that immigration is one of the main things that's driving support for the sort of parties on the right and the far right. I was looking, when you look at the four things that people in the UK are looking at from the general election as the most important issues. Health is the top, economy and cost of living crisis second and third, and immigration is fourth. Education is down at somewhere like sort of 10th or 11th, and I remember going back a few years, it was education and health with the two main things. So immigration, unfortunately, has been, pushed into this agenda. And I can imagine, in France, as somebody who visits France quite a lot, it is something there that is driving people's the way that they're voting, because again, the right are very, very effective with sort of garnering support from people who are under the impression that people are coming to their countries, taking things that belong to them, that is impacting their ability to get children into schools or to get appointments with doctors and hospitals, whereas the reality is it's governments not funding things and not running things properly that's the issue. So fingers crossed. There were some examples, I think, in Scandinavia where the left and the Greens did better, but I think, as you mentioned, the French election is going to be sort of key, and to a certain extent, what's happening in the UK with the general election, where reform, yes, they seem to be gathering some momentum, but it looks to be almost entirely at the expense of the Conservative Party. So they're basically splitting the Conservative Party from what was left of their moderate into the right wing. So interesting times.
No, absolutely, and I think it's also a point worth making that regardless of the extent to which the far right in any parliament would hold power, they are also successful at pulling the centre and the centre right to the right. And I wonder whether we will see that particularly clearly in this upcoming French election now. Will we see Macron have to sort of push his rhetoric rightward to try and pull back some of these people who are being sort of lured away by the far right? But as you said, it also speaks to wider patterns of disillusionment sort of across politics, and certainly not just limited within the UK. How would you react to the results, Vicky? Does it feel strange to you as well in terms of not actually voting in these elections but just spectating them?
Yeah, it does. It really does. It's pretty depressing that we're only spectators at present, and hopefully that's going to change at some point in the not too distant future. So I suppose what Macron's done by calling this election is been quite brave, and I hope he achieves what he sets out to. To go back to what Hugh was saying about immigration being sort of number 4 on the list, it's kind of paradoxical that number 1 is health and social care, and actually in order to deliver those services we need immigrants, particularly in Scotland. I'm not sure about in Wales, but to deliver health and social care we can't do it without immigration, and Brexit really impacted our capacity to do that. And as somebody with a health and social care background, we've seen the private sector care agencies been completely and utterly propped up in the cities anyway, less so in the more rural areas, by the Home Office visa scheme, and so many members of their workforce are now coming to work in health and social care in that way, and thank goodness for it. But at the same time, the Scottish Government's now in a situation where we then have to prop up those very poor wages, because we've made a commitment to pay the real living wage of £12 an hour to everyone in health and social care. So people are coming, and they are actually being better paid than they might have been, which is good. I've gone off at a bit of a tangent, but on purpose, because I do think that um, when I'm knocking doors, which I'm doing every single day at the moment, as you can imagine, people are not talking to me about immigration. People are talking to me about their mum waiting on a new knee or a new hip, or their dad being delayed in hospital because they can't get a package of care, those types of things. And it all interlinks very strongly with this anti-immigration rhetoric that's coming from the right wing, and it's so damaging and so dangerous.
Absolutely. Particularly when, as you say, in Scotland's case, there is absolutely a positive case for immigration to be made. Not just a positive case, an absolute necessity case. With an ageing, declining population, our public sector does not survive without positive net migration. It also brings me on to the topic of the general election itself, because I was really sort of struck by how passionately Stephen Flynn made the case for that in the sort of 7-leader TV debate in relation to immigration, but also equally that across those debates that I've seen so far, the SNP, the Greens, and Plaid have often received the best responses from the audience. They're not feeling the need to stay on virtually the same hymn sheet as Labour and the Tories. But I wonder, Hugh, why do you think that is actually, that what people are responding to positively is parties willing to talk a little bit more outside of the box or distinguish themselves against what's seen as a political consensus?
Yeah, well, I think it's because the majority of people think that way. And I think that's the sad thing is, as you've mentioned already, when policy announcements have been made in the last few weeks, they're always to appeal to the right. There's very little being sort of proposed to appeal to the, what we would describe as the centre or the left, because it's just assumed that those people from a Labour perspective will vote for them. As you say, Stephen Flynn and Rhun ap Iorwerth and also Carla Denyer, are making the point that, the discussion around immigration is a complete false flag. I've been doing research into it. The majority of people who are coming to the UK are either coming to study or to work. So it's not a case of there's a perception that that the uncontrolled immigration is causing havoc and they're all illegal immigrants, because that's the picture they're trying to paint. And whether Farage likes it or not, when he's talking about immigration, he's talking about a specific type of immigrant, a specific religious background and a specific colour. And that's the reality of what they're peddling. Whereas the reality is the majority of people who have come, the three nationalities are Nigeria, Chinese, and India. So those are the three countries that the majority of people who've immigrated here. So they're not Muslims. So again, it's this, I think Islamophobia is what is driving a lot of the discourse around immigration, and it is distasteful. But as Stephen Flynn and Rhun have pointed out, we need immigration because we got an aging population. I've been discussing education this morning on Talking Wales. The number of pupils in primary education is going to be falling because people are having less children. So if you have less children and older people, for an economy to thrive, you need people working in it, and that's why we have immigration. And I think one of the big differences we've seen in Wales in particular is from as Vicky mentioned, health and social care is so reliant on workers from abroad. I've been in hospital over the last 5 years, receiving sort of treatment. And when I've been in on a ward, the majority of people who were on my ward, well, almost exclusively, were all white Welsh people. So, and the people who were treating us were people from all over the world. So, that's the reality. But what's been interesting is with social care, with Brexit, a lot of people, who were coming from Eastern Europe, who on the outside looked like us, but they were maybe Polish or Romanian. That they sort of blended in, and I think what we're seeing now is because those people have returned and they're not interested, we're getting more people coming from places like Africa, so it's becoming more obvious to people. But rather than seeing it as a positive, it's being seen, the right, again, they use racism as a tool to divide people and to encourage people to vote for them. And it's frankly disgusting.
Absolutely, and that's a very sort of vivid picture to paint of the imbalances in who's receiving care, who's giving care in the UK. Vicky, with you sort of being out canvassing a lot at the moment, are you here? I mean, it's particularly in Scotland, but are you hearing anything around reform here, or is this just a sort of a Nigel Farage thing, and people have more to worry about, frankly?
So probably since we started campaigning, which is a good few months ago now, I must have knocked, I don't know, hundreds and hundreds of doors, maybe 1,000. And I have had one person who said they're going to vote for reform. But, not everybody tells us their voting intention, and particularly, people that are going to vote in a way that might not be so socially acceptable. So no, I'm not really hearing that. But what I would say, and I don't want to oversimplify it, but Scotland is not an overwhelmingly centre-right country, so we don't have to have that type of politics. We don't have to use those same lines that they have to use south of the border, and we're very proud of that. That doesn't stop. This morning I was watching Martin Geisler, and we had one SNP person and versus I think 3 or 4 unionist politicians, and it was just one kind of gotcha moment after another for the unionists against the SNP, and people on the doors can see that too. They can see the way the media is not fair to us, the mainstream media, and misrepresents a lot of the very hard work we've done to try and make Scotland a more fair and equal country within the confines of the Barnett consequentials.
No, indeed. Obviously, the sort of the disparities in the media when it comes to treating SNP or Plaid or indeed the Greens, in contrast with how much attention Nigel Farage gets, is very striking. Although I am wondering in the next 3 weeks whether there is a possibility that we will see. So I don't think to the extent that it's affecting the Tories, but whether actually reform has the potential to eat at least some of the Labour vote as well, simply on the basis that they are doing so well because of particularly the Tories' failures, not because there is, huge enthusiasm around the UK for Keir Starmer or for their manifesto currently. How much of a role do you think apathy has a risk of playing in this election? Go back to you, Hugh, first.
Yeah, I think what's interesting with this election is, and this is completely anecdotal, and it might just be absolute nonsense. But yesterday I was out in an out of town shopping complex in Bridgend, sort of Saturday. Weather wasn't all that fantastic, but I couldn't get anywhere to park, and I couldn't believe it. Anyway, I managed to park the car, and the shops were all full, and it was almost as if you had this sense of people had realised that this Conservative government coming to an end, and people have started coming out and realising, that there's change on the horizon. So I don't know. I just picked up a mood there. So I think from voter perspective, I think people will be mobilised. I think there's clearly going to be an issue around voter ID. The fact that the Conservatives have sort of tried to disenfranchise, and that's one of the big things that's been really disappointing. That Starmer could have come out and said, within the first 100 days we're going to repeal that and get rid of these things. So again, he's erring on the side of caution and trying to sort of appeal to the right who think that it's some sort of good idea. But yeah, no, I think it's interesting, and I think so there's a lesson to be had from Wales. Is remember the only place that UKIP and then they became Brexit before they became Reform have had sort of any sort of real representation is in the Senedd. When they had at one time, I think 6 or 7 members, and to be honest, they were there. They were paid. They were absolutely useless because they haven't got any policy ideas, and they do tend to be, people on the right who are very populist and just don't understand how the world works. So, there's a warning from history there. And with the Senedd elections coming up in 2 years' time, it's going to be really, really interesting because we have the Labour Party in Wales, despite they're doing quite well for the general election polling wise. The polling for the next Senedd elections, Labour are down or quite markedly, Plaid Cymru are up, but also Reform are up because we've got a First Minister that's embroiled in sort of issues at the moment around him accepting £200,000 in donations from a convicted environmental sort of company owner dumping sort of waste. He had a vote of no confidence that the Labour Party tried to pass off as a gimmick. I don't remember them trying to when they were discussing a vote of no confidence in Hamza Yousaf that was going to be a gimmick, but obviously horses for courses. So yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting. I think there will be sort of people going out there to vote. In Wales, sadly, especially in working class areas, where Labour, were the traditional party, Reform will be picking up votes from Labour in those places because, again, people are being told that their lives are rubbish, that that they can't get jobs, that these people are coming here and they're getting houses and they're being put up or whatever, which is the nonsense. But people are falling from it, and I think one of the key issues here is how we ensure that society is informed, because I think that's one of the reasons supporting Broadcast Scotland is important. That's why we're developing Talking Wales, is that we need to get a way of actually letting people know what is actually going on in the world. We need to let people know what the situation is about immigration, because I don't think that sort of the BBC, they're doing the job to a certain extent, but they're not giving the full picture. And it's really important, that we develop platforms now to inform people. Because of social media, people are being misinformed and they're being misled and they're being manipulated.
Indeed, well, these are deep, sort of complex issues and require much more than a superficial soundbite or approach. Just while you've brought up the issue of Vaughan Gething and the vote of no confidence, there was a sort of Wales specific story I wanted to pick up on and see if you could give us a little bit more information about it potentially, and that's the resignation of Labour councillor Martin Shipton. I'm not sure if you've come across this story already, Hugh.
No, I think you might be confusing. Martin Shipton's a journalist.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. No, but there's a Labour councillor in Carmarthenshire who has resigned, citing sort of issues within the Labour disciplinary process.
Yeah, I think I think that there is disquiet within sort of Labour in Wales. I'm a Plaid Cymru member, but I know a lot of people within the Labour Party in Wales, and there is genuine disquiet. Because again, not everybody, you can't tar everybody with the same brush. There are lots of very good people within sort of Labour in Wales, and Labour in Wales is a very different beast to Labour in Scotland, and has in the past been progressive. And I think there's pushback because obviously you had the previous First Minister who was a progressive. He was a supporter of Jeremy Corbyn, and now we have Vaughan Gething, who is seen very much as Starmer's man in Wales. We've seen, in the last week, talking about, the constitutional reform and changes that the Commission in Wales has put forward about devolving crime and justice, and Labour rolling back on those things that that Labour in Wales have agreed to. So there is disquiet in Wales. I don't think it'll have an impact in the general election. I know there's coming up on the doorstep, what's happening with Vaughan Gething, but I think it'll be in 2 years' time. And especially, I think Starmer is going to be a big test for him. If he can't turn things around quickly, in 2 years' time, that election is going to be very, very interesting in Wales. I'm not sure when the next Holyrood elections are, but again, I think Labour are going to suffer at those elections if the SNP get knocked back at this general election, because again, people are voting on a national issue as opposed to sort of national from a Scottish or Welsh perspective.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, and the Holyrood election will also be in 2026. So both Scotland and Wales will act as a bit of a sort of midterm election on the incoming government. Turning back to you, Vicky, I was sort of reflecting on how much overlap or deliberate sort of overlap we sometimes see in terms of reserved issues versus devolved issues at the moment in this election campaign. I've certainly been struck by both the volume and the content of the Labour messaging that I've personally been getting, emails, adverts on YouTube, adverts in podcasts, and the fact that it's stressing that it's Scottish Labour and that it's making claims around things like the NHS, which this election is not about, and they do not have the power to affect in Scotland in that way. How much of an issue do you think this is? Does it reflect, Westminster politicians just not really being in tune with the dynamics of devolution, or is it something else?
That's a good question. Just to go back to what Hugh said about sort of working class communities and people that maybe are feeling a bit, have been impacted by cost of living and whose lives have not got better over the last few years and feeling disenfranchised enough perhaps not to use their vote at all. I'm certainly seeing that, and it's really worrying that people who are, the hardest hit by the Conservative policies are the people that potentially might not get out and sort of exercise their franchise and vote. What I would say about the devolved versus reserved issues is I think it's a deliberate muddying of the water, and it's difficult to keep the message on track about this being about reserved issues, because a lot of people don't necessarily understand the political system, especially people that are not particularly engaged in politics and maybe aren't that clear on the impact that reserved issues have on our ability to deliver what's been devolved to Scotland. So it's hard with the very mixed messaging that we're getting from, for example, Labour and their YouTube videos. It's hard to explain to people that the Barnett consequentials directly impact our capacity to do things better. And, if we had a more fair financial settlement, then we would be delivering, health with less waiting lists, etc., etc. And I think Labour particularly are capitalising on that in their messaging.
No, absolutely. And obviously, as you said, the potential for aspects of privatisation, further privatisation coming into the NHS in England or in Wales, will also have a knock-on effect on NHS Scotland, inevitably. So
absolutely.
Through the Barnett consequentials.
Trying to express that to people, if NHS services are privatised in NHS England, then that directly impacts our consequentials and our ability to deliver services. And it's quite an abstract concept to get across to people that are not, living and breathing politics like we are.
Well, how do you think then that we could or we should be doing things differently within areas like the health service or with funding.
So until we have the ability to, set our own properly set taxation and, be in charge of borrowing in Scotland, I don't think we can get to the point we need to get to, which is to really invest in prevention. If we're just talking about health and social care, and there's no way that we can invest in prevention without continuing to fund crisis until the prevention is really bedded in and it's working. And that's the big problem, is that we have, because year on year we are, with inflation and various different pressures and a cut to our budget in real terms, we're less able to invest in the prevention that we need to prevent, people ending up in hospital in the first place. We're kind of stuck, and I say that as someone who sits on an integration joint board as the SNP representative, and social care ends up being kind of the poor relation when it comes to the NHS, and it's understandable that happens. But the less we invest in social care, the more people end up in hospital, and even working with the third sector, we've got so many wonderful partners across the third sector where we probably could be doing a lot better already, and to be fair, but councils also make their own unique decisions about how they're going to implement their social care policy. And I know, for example, one of the things I've been pushing for is to make sure that the Carers Act funding, the Carers Act, which is a fantastic piece of legislation, ends, that funding is given to unpaid carers at the point of need, rather than being translated into delivering services once people have had an assessment. Simple prevention like that would make a huge amount of difference. But, I've taken a motion to full council, a motion to the IJB in Edinburgh to say we need to stop spending this Carers Act money, which is not ring-fenced, on established services and give it directly to carers. But there's no appetite for that. And we're in a Labour, Lib Dem, Tory council that actually like to use politics to kind of determine policy, unfortunately, and use the opportunity to bash the SNP. And it's quite a difficult space.
That's obviously frustrating, but I'm particularly struck, obviously, as you said, the need for better social care, the need potentially for a sort of a national care service running in parallel to the NHS is becoming sort of more prominent, sort of more thought about as people understand the real drag effect that a poor social care system has on the NHS. But this also inevitably, it links back to Brexit, it links back to austerity. It's utterly interwoven with this sort of plethora of issues across UK politics. And with...
Can I just say about the National Care Service, it's really disgusting how the Unionist parties hijacked a really helpful and positive conversation about how we get social care better, and we make the terms and conditions better to, make it a job that people want to do, and to welcome people into the workforce, because it's the most rewarding job in the world, really, and apart from financially, obviously. But when England, Labour in England are actually proposing a national care service and then campaigning against it in Scotland, it's so hypocritical. And yes, there are reasons why councils are reluctant to look at care boards, because it would take the responsibility for delivering social care and 40% of the workforce out of councils. So I understand that. But now the latest sort of iteration of the National Care Service is looking at reform and integration joint boards, but it's still not getting the support that it needs from the unionist side, and that's what's preventing us being able to progress it at the speed that we need to.
Now, Vicky said earlier, sort of in relation to how crucial immigration is for aspects like social care. I'm assuming that's quite a similar picture for you in Wales, Hugh, as well. And also, I think that inevitably ties into debates around immigration, around Brexit, as we've spoken about. I'm quite interested in how people in Wales reflect on their NHS currently. It's been obviously Labour run for for some time. It receives criticism for being sort of the worst performing between it and Northern Ireland. But sort of how do people on the ground actually sort of see it? How do they relate to it? Do they perceive the issues in that way?
Yeah, and again, this goes back to the issue of people being informed, because when you look at the situation in Wales with the health service, we've got a similar situation here where health and social care is, they're trying to sort of join those things together. And that's something that is being developed by a sort of a Labour government with the support of Plaid Cymru and the Lib Dems. I'm not sure about the Conservatives, but I'd imagine the Conservatives, they support that as well. So, and this is the issue, is people don't understand from a devolution point of view. COVID helped people to understand that better. But we still have around, sort of 40-50% probably who don't realise that health has devolved, and it's actually the responsibility of Welsh Government. People don't understand, the block grant. So, Wales gets a lump of money, as Scotland does, and it's up to Wales and Scotland to decide how to spend those across the devolved competencies. So obviously Scotland have got more powers when it comes to things like sort of justice, but you compared to Wales. But in Wales we've got, it is the worst perform of all of the 4 health services in the UK. It's the worst performing. We've got one health board that's been in special measures for I can't remember how long now, and it was quite ironic. I saw Angela Rayner was in Scotland yesterday, saying that 14 years of Tory chaos and 17 years of SNP, and I was just asking, well, what exactly in Scotland is worse under the SNP that is actually better in Wales under a Labour government? And nobody can answer that. But it's just that's the thing that gets me is using this this avoidance of Labour actually being in control of things in Wales and just ignoring it, that it's actually happening. When they come to Scotland, and I'm surprised that opposition parties. And I think the Conservatives, do it. They raise the issue on a regular basis, and I think the SNP do, but I think they could be doing more, because Wales is waiting lists are longer, education performance is worse here, so the 2 main competencies that they have actually control over are performing worse in the UK.
Yeah, it absolutely bears repeating, and I think with all that we've discussed today, I would reflect on the the dangers of promising change when you have no intention of delivering anything meaningful. Finally, to turn to something a little bit more lighthearted, depending on your perspective. Obviously, Scotland and Germany played each other in the opening game of Euro 2024 with mixed results, let's say. However, this is also leading more people, I think, to reflect on how they relate to national sports across the sort of the 4 nations of the UK. Certainly, the Scottish Greens, I believe, also the SNP, are in favour of all games played by the Scottish national football team should be free to watch on television. I'm sure that you would back something similar with regards to Wales, Hugh.
Yeah.
Although sadly,
Well,
Wales
we already have that in Wales. So the Welsh national team, their games are shown on S4C in the Welsh language. So even when they're on pay-per-view in English, you can watch it for free through the media with Welsh language commentary. But when it comes to the Euros this year, I'm sort of denying its existence. It's just not happening. If Wales aren't there, it doesn't exist.
Fair enough. No Wales, no party. How are you feeling about the football, Vicky? Depressed? Still a little bit optimistic?
I mean, you can't fault our enthusiastic supporters who are fabulous ambassadors for Scotland, and I just love watching the Tartan Army. I think they're great. What I would say is I watched it with my teenager she used to play football. She gave up for netball a couple of years back, so she's quite clued up, and I'm not really. And she ended that game pretty depressed and pretty raging, to be honest. And I'm not sure. Oh, but we always knew that it's the other two games that we have more of a chance in this round. So fingers crossed we can, kind of dust ourselves off and do what we do as Scottish people and manage our own disappointment and try our best anyway.
Well, exactly. Whatever we end up doing, I'm sure that we'll have fun doing it. Well, that's all from us for today. Thank you very much for tuning in. If you would like to support Broadcasting Scotland, you can subscribe to become a supporter for £5 per month. Our programmes will always be free, but we do appreciate any support you can give. As we've said, it's crucial to get other voices and other messages out there at the moment in this election. Thank you to my guests, Councillor Vicky Nicolson and Hugh Marshall. Thank you for joining me, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your Sunday. Goodbye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.